When Renee introduced me, and introduced Darius and me, she talked about us as writing fiction, which doesn't seem to qualify us at all to be speaking to people with the kind of knowledge that you people have. But we would like to justify ourselves in your eyes, because there's something really interesting about choosing to do a fictional account of history, but with supporting endnotes. And when people have asked me about the amount of work that went into writing the trilogy, I've said it was 3 dissertations, because for us to get things accurate, we needed to do the amount of work that was really like a dissertation for each book. But the whole idea was to bring them to life, to bring these characters to life, to find out things that Green Flake had said about his time as a slave. The fact that Green Flake had been told that his mother had died, which was not true. He was told that, and according to his granddaughter, because if a slave knew that his mother was alive, he might run away and try and find her. Family meant a tremendous amount to Green. This is his gravestone. He chose the epitaph and helped carve it. It says, "In my father's house are many mansions." This is a place that has great meaning for me, for Darius, for many of our members of the Genesis group who sometimes just find this a place of solace if they're feeling some trials and tribulations in their lives, to come and sit by the grave of a man who they know came across the plains twice, actually, came across, built a cabin for the Flake family, then went back and led them to it. But the whole idea of choosing to imagine what their lives were like, to not be limited to these are the facts, these are the dates, but to really try and, as much as possible, using their own words and their own writings when available, but to really try to imagine this is what they felt. And what this goes into is the whole idea of opening our worlds and learning to appreciate the worlds of those around us. And that's kind of where we're going to be heading. We've titled this Empathetic Imagination, reading between the lines and standing on the promises, but we're not going to be restraining ourselves to just our books. I want to tell you, my parents are here, which is wonderful. I only get to see my parents once or twice a year. They tend to live outside the country. They're right now from China, but are here to celebrate their 50th anniversary, and then they'll go back. But my father's a linguist, so I grew up surrounded by books in other languages, people from other cultures, and when I was 19, Dad took us to live in Guatemala. Now, any of you who have been to foreign countries and you thought that you spoke any of the language, I was under no illusion that I spoke the language at all. But after a little while, it really feels like an international conspiracy to make you feel like an idiot. When you listen to people talk, and you know that there's no way that what they're saying could possibly make sense. It's, they've gotten together and figured that when you're around, they will just talk gibberish to frustrate you to no end. Well, I remember being terribly, terribly frustrated. I was in a little place called Tatsum, Guatemala, and people spoke a language. Let me just give you a sample of the language. Children would just laugh and laugh when I would try and say the word for yellow, which is It's not a sound we even have. Thief is We don't make that sound in English. And as I would try and say it and I'd try and duplicate it, it was one of the most lovely bonding experiences because I couldn't do it. But the time came when little by little I started understanding a word and then a few words and then things would sort of fit together. It came so that I returned. I ended up loving this place that initially I hated. I kind of had the people reduced to Kakchikel Indians. They're this color, they wear this kind of clothes, and they talk that language. And then I returned a couple of other times and actually lived with an Indian family, a Kakchikel Indian family. I slept on a mat. I helped the hermana make tortillas on a comal. I lived their life. And I came to a remarkable appreciation. I learned I don't know if you've ever seen the Star Trek The Next Generation episode. My husband loves it, where it's people talk in metaphors. And in order to understand the metaphors, you have to know their culture. You have to understand the stories that they're drawing their metaphors from. Well, Kachakil Indians speak in metaphors. A door is ruchirich och, the mouth of the house. And all of it is like that. So as you move into the language, it's a whole mindset. And if you do it with love, it becomes the most beautiful transformation, because you start recognizing new ways of looking at things. That same principle, when I was quite young, I read a book that maybe many of you have read called Black Like Me by Howard Griffin. Now, I remember my grandmother finding that book on my bookshelf. I was probably 12, and saying, "Oh, Margaret, I think you can find something much more uplifting than this." But that became an important book. I still remember a lot of it, but especially now as I look back, because so much of the work that Darius and I did in moving towards the trilogy, in giving life to the people we were going to write about, and in my learning to work with Darius, was learning about being Black, learning about what things were like that I had never experienced. Now, I have been a redhead, and that comes with its own challenges, but I've never had my mother explain to me that I couldn't talk to somebody of the white race because she could lose her job. I can't go back 2 generations to slave years. So it was a whole concept. One of our little conflicts was over somebody rewrote a beautiful preface that Darius had written, because they were afraid that the way he had written it was a little too strong. And I went along with the rewrite, and that was one of the strongest arguments that we ever had. And I take full responsibility for that, because I had not understood that they were taking his life and suggesting, let's revise this to fit the paradigm we really want. It doesn't work that way. For us to fully move into that other world involves truly seeing the other. And in this, I need to quote my husband's very favorite philosopher. I'm not actually quoting the philosopher himself, I'm quoting Bruce's paraphrasing of him. The philosopher's name is Emmanuel Levinas. I'll try and read this slowly. We've gotten it as accessible as I think we can, but it's a gorgeous idea. If it were not for the face of the other person, I might indeed maintain the illusion that everything I experience and enjoy, food, landscapes, the complete collection of Beatles music, which my husband has, is mine. But once I encounter the other, I must realize that there is something absolutely and irreducibly other than myself, and that the world also belongs to the other. But this does not limit my freedom, for freedom would have no meaning in a world that belonged entirely to me. The other invests my freedom, gives it meaning, makes it possible for me to make moral choices. I become responsible, for the other invites me simply by his or her presence to respond. The other, through his or her neediness and vulnerability, invites me to offer myself and what I have in service and sustenance. At the same time, the other commands not by words, but simply by the vulnerability of his or her face, "Thou shalt not kill." Emmanuel Levinas is a philosopher I highly recommend. But as we've talked about the history that we were taught in elementary and high school and middle school, I learned about Eli Whitney. I never learned about Marcus Garvey until I was working with Darius. There are other names, Medgar Evers, who I didn't learn about until 5 years ago. All of these remarkable names. Sojourner Truth is pretty recent in my historical knowledge. All of that history was not included in my textbooks. These faces that now have become precious to me, the history that they've given has become precious, but it was not included in the textbooks. And that's one reason that we feel so strongly about expanding LDS history to include these remarkable faces that we've been able to write about. It expands our sense of responsibility. It enriches the world that we have. We want to talk a little bit about Darius' own ancestors. There were a couple of times when, as we were